Hi everyone. Sorry that this took so long. I was focusing on getting rid of some dead weight in my life, and I'm proud to say that this episode is finally ready. It's one of the biggest ones yet, and I really hope you enjoy. So if you don't follow the show already, please do leave it a good review, and I really hope you learned something along the way. Welcome back to the show you all know and love. It's Imperialism and the Fringe. If you're new here, we focus on three main things. Number one being American interventionism and imperialism around the world. Number two being niche hobbies, interests, things that humans do that are pretty wacky and expert in their own sort of division or right that we may not know about. And finally, people like me graduating without a plan and the lack of content thereof. I have been reading books, watching movies, reading some good poems. Maybe I'll give you some recommendations at the end of it. This episode took me a lot longer than others because not only was it pretty insidious to try and wrap my head around, but it definitely caused a big perspective shift for me, and I think it might for you as well. We're going to be talking about Vietnam today. This is something that growing up, you always hear veterans talk about things and say, oh, back in Nam or back in my day, and I would always just brush it off like, oh, it's a past conflict. I know a lot of people were against it. I don't know. There's a hippie movement that was like, no to the war. Beats me. However, I finally sat down, read a book about it, actually did some research, and it took me some time to fully digest it all. What we did over there was horrifying. And at the same time, some of the systems that we put in place were basically an example that shifted our whole intelligence paradigm, and I think we still use tactics like that today. Not only that, but we make it seem like other countries are the ones doing it to themselves. The CIA's involvement in this is unbelievably backed by evidence and even quotes from one of the CIA directors himself, Jim Angleton. What I'm talking about specifically in terms of the Vietnam conflict and the Vietnam quote-unquote war is that of the Phoenix program, or Operation Phoenix, in which the United States started systematically undermining the Viet Cong infrastructure and trying to fight the terrorists that they claimed were starting an insurgency against the popular masses. However, this wasn't the case at all. The Viet Cong and the communists there had decades of preparation, and their infrastructure stretched across most of the civilian population. Almost everybody had known or was related to someone in that group, and by no means was it the minority. The United States decided to back President Thieu, and it basically led to another series of right-wing dictatorships like that of Guatemala. What the United States did in Vietnam involved creating blacklists, taking census accounts, and killing innocent civilians, women, children, and bombing even Cambodia. I mean, the terror and the horrors that have been unraveled throughout the years is pretty unspeakable. What we engaged in was called quote-unquote counterterrorism, or anti-terrorist activities, which basically means we were committing terrorism to try and prevent the terrorists from terrorizing. Makes a lot of sense, right? We would create these blacklists and then send in teams of people in black pajamas disguised as the Viet Cong and the communists and take out key Viet Cong leaders, round up whole villages, and bring them in for interrogations, or just execute them on the spot to make an example. People were thrown out of helicopters, people were raped, mutilated, maimed, and tons of war crimes were committed. Knowingly as well. One of the precursor missions to the Phoenix program was called O-Plan 34. It involved intelligence and subverting the infrastructure of communist activities within Laos and Cambodia. A lot of people signed non-disclosure agreements, so they never really spoke about it. However, others stepped forward because of their conscience. For a lot of people, Phoenix was an ideological turning point. I feel the same way, and this might kind of be the same for you as well, once you learn about what we've done. The Phoenix program was made in 1967 by the CIA to neutralize the enemy Viet Cong infrastructure. This was any civilians who supported the North. This is a outright Geneva Convention violation right then and there. This infrastructure was anyone involved. Relatives, shopkeepers. You could have been sweeping the floor at a movie theater and you could have been associated with them. The Vietnamese version of the Phoenix program was called Phung Hoang. And excuse me if I don't pronounce some things right throughout this episode. I'm doing my best. There was a 2-year detainment involved with no trial at all. You could be held up to 2 years, and any sort of anonymous tip or informer could send you there. So you got to be careful who you make enemies with. There was even quotas of 1,800 neutralizations of the enemies per month. They killed entire families of the Viet Cong in order to basically just instill all this fear and say, hey, you don't even want to speak with the people on the other side, even though the vast majority of the population was associated with them. The United States took such a strong position and tried squashing what they viewed as a small population, but in reality, they had decades of preparation. The Viet Cong developed from past French colonialism. Context of the situation is extremely important to understand how we ultimately lost and embarrassed ourselves. The strongest anti-French Vietnamese were in the North. They strongly disliked the West. This ultimately led to the Viet Cong being concentrated there and during the whole war effort. By 1880 onwards, any Vietnamese nationalists had zero protection because they were being influenced by these colonizers and imperialists. The French were deeply enrooted in the police, the community, and other versions of their infrastructure. The Vietnamese that were self-serving and working for the French were called supplétifs. If convicted or associated with criminal groups or the nationalists, they'd be sent to a dungeon at Con Song prison, and they ultimately turned to terrorism because they viewed the situation as having no other choice. By 1859, in far-off regions of the jungle, on basically inaccessible land that's totally far off and removed, Viet Cong guerrillas started selective terror. They would attack groups at random in lands that they were quite familiar with. The French responded extremely harshly and bombed them back hard. This only caused the Viet Cong to hone their skills and become better at intelligence over time. Ho Chi Minh declared independence in 1945, and the Office of Strategic Services, otherwise known as the OSS, people from America end up finding ties to Moscow, even after they supported him. Very convenient that they find these ties once he declares independence. So at this point, there was Chinese in the north, the French were in Hanoi, and the British had the south. It was largely concentrated to the US and French by the early 1950s. The United States was encouraging these sorts of activities, and we gave the French $3 billion from 1950 to 1954. The United States made a deal with the Vietnamese government to instill Ngo Dinh Diem, and we were pretending to advise him, telling him, oh, we're not like France, we're not like those other imperialists, we're going to help you, we're looking to promote democracy and, encourage good growth of the government. So Colonel Edward Lansdale, who has come up a lot of times in my readings and was friends with Allen Dulles, one of the worst CIA directors, helped create a very pro-America Vietnam. And they used favorable minorities, they called them, like Filipinos or people that were predisposed to have these strong right viewpoints that would hate the Viet Cong naturally and by definition. They trained groups like this to fight for the CIA, and they often used shell companies like the Civil Air Transport. And Lansdale knew it was political. The United States wanted a party that would back Diem. They wanted Diem to disband any of the Viet Cong forces even though the communists at this point were pretty peaceful, towards the Americans at least. So maybe he was rotated out because of this. Lansdale was eventually moved, and Dulles told him to not get involved anymore. In 1954, there was a program at Michigan State to help learn about the American way that became the CIA launchpad and command center for the special police in Vietnam. The undercover Sûreté, from that French origin, became the Vietnamese Bureau of Investigations, one of the foundations of Phoenix. Diem would send people dressed as Viet Cong in black pajamas to do dirty work. They'd often be disguised as contractors or civilian workers, and in teams of 5 to 6, go in and execute key leaders or destroy entire villages. The VBI, Vietnamese Bureau of Investigations, VBI, made the CIA an annual Ban Tran Liet Viet Cong, which was a full biography of the Viet Cong meetings and the infrastructure that they thought they held. And this continued all the way up until 1964. Diem tortured people much more than the Viet Cong did. It's important to note. And the people he sent were dressed as the Viet Cong. So it's impossible to know the full extent of violence that the Viet Cong even committed. They even had a nonviolence policy until 1959. So in May 1959, Diem enacted Law 1059, and it was a proclamation. Any people convicted of acts of sabotage or threats to national security, a key statement that is an all-encompassing sort of phrase anybody could use to convict someone of doing something, would be punishable by death or prison without any sort of appeal. Within 1 year, they had 50,000 political prisoners. The Viet Cong makes a group called Don 559. They started infiltrating and training all these southern troops. The U.S. responded with Green Berets and Special Forces. They kept escalating the militant activity and trading hands. They promised the Green Berets and Special Forces political power and special influence. Some people would go undercover. They'd be in, like I said, 5 to 6 teams, all the way ranging up to 12-man teams that would walk into villages. The United States started supplying weaponry to the VBI and regional forces in the South, and they started disappearing people again and looking for contact lists. This was sort of the start of what Phoenix would ultimately become. They continued importing these favorable minorities that they knew would hate the communists and training them as well to fight the insurgent leaders. It was very easy to make these sorts of criminals or other far-right groups from other countries do their bidding versus trying to convince an American soldier who grew up with American ideals that they're trying to enact democracy by executing people. An infamous figure, Father Hoa, and the Chinese Catholics fought Viet Cong, and they did a lot of dirty work for the Americans. In 1960, the People's Revolutionary Party was formed in the South, and it was called to expel all Americans. The Viet Cong infrastructure involved a few different things, so let me try and sort of make a web for you here. The Viet Cong infrastructure at the top was the central office of South Vietnam. They had the People's Revolutionary Party, the Northern Liberation Force, the Viet Cong, and the Liberation Army. They touched every area of society, whether that be in the North or the South. So the Viet Cong infrastructure was just Vietnam, basically. They had the Central Research Agency, which was their version of the CIA. An important thing to note on this part of the story is that the United States copies what the communists were doing a lot of the time in deciding how to respond. The Viet Cong had a group in 1960 called the An Ninh, and they were creating blacklists of people in the southern Vietnam government, and the amount of these blacklists doubled at that time. They were creating propaganda campaigns, engaged in psyops, double agents, and they were just doing assassinations already. The CIA learned from them. There's definitely a revisionist view here, because we don't really get to learn about that part of it. We copied their exact methods moving forward. By 1962, there was 12,000 U.S. troops in Vietnam. Vietnam isn't even a war, technically. There was no declaration of war. So we copied the communists and we started engaging in counter-terror campaigns all around the country. We sent in hunter-killer teams. They would snuff out and find a lot of troops. Killer teams would then be sent in by the CIA with big helicopters, bombs, and whatever was necessary to take them out. Viet Cong defectors were a key asset that they utilized. They tried turning a lot of people and teaching them about the ideals of democracy. They engaged in a lot of black propaganda in response to the Viet Cong. The United States would dress up as commercial companies, electricians, workers' medical teams even, and they would influence the press in order to create their own narrative. Now, heading towards 1963, there was an increase in escalations with the Buddhist groups, and we even killed some at temples. This led Washington to call for an end to the Vietnamese Special Forces, because counter-terrorists were more effective. Kennedy eventually says, hey, why are we even in Vietnam? Maybe we should withdraw. That'd be a good move. Guess what? He gets killed 3 days later. Although just a subtle suggestion, pretty scary. Lyndon B. Johnson is then conveniently ready to attack Vietnam. Plan 34 involved a special operations group launching attacks from what was known as Phoenix Island. The Viet Cong responded and attacked the USS Maddox. LBJ then passes the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution and a bombing campaign that starts this war, if you want to call it that. More like an invasion. After the fall of Diem, the CIA officers start to control all sorts of provinces in the southern regions. They invited people like those in the Khmer Rouge to work in the counter-terror teams because they know are extremely effective. I'm sure they'll get their own episode at some point. Some more examples of counter-terror involve taking the liver of their enemies, because Buddhists wanted it to be intact, and they would staple calling cards to their third eyes right on their forehead in order to encourage them to defect or call the United States for support and help. The United States and the GVN, the government of Vietnam, cadres were pumped with political propaganda. They would ask different villages about what they needed, and if they informed on the Viet Cong, they would build them a bridge or give them the necessary water that they needed. Didn't matter if they were really Viet Cong or not, but as long as they were giving them names, the United States would funnel in money and help them. Rural construction by the southern government was trying to attack the Viet Cong infrastructure at a very small scale. And they were also displacing civilians all over the countryside because they thought dividing the population in that way would be effective. However, it obviously just pissed everyone off. These were renamed Revolutionary Development Cadres, and they were out there thinking that they would be, really intercepting and cutting off the Viet Cong, but they didn't realize that they had already been infiltrated heavily from the start. The CIA started running a program on political action in a sovereign state. They were copying tactics of the USSR and Hitler's Germany, the Gestapo at times. And they were also trying to say that democracy was coming while they were doing it. They started a family census program in 1962 where their aim was to ID tons of Viet Cong, but they just created blacklists of civilians, women, children, anyone in between. They also used these IDs to try and recruit people. They wanted expendable Vietnamese and people that they could have killed pretty easily or to do their dirty work. In Project 24, some of these people would even find Viet Cong villas, call in the strike team, and without waiting, the Americans would just bomb the whole village with the agent inside of it. The CIA training foreigners like this is typically in their best interests, as we can all see. Infamous in Vietnam, the National Interrogation Center was set up in Saigon's HQ. The CIA and the Central Intelligence Office were all next to each other, and there were several hundred prisoners there. So both intelligence agencies from the US and Vietnam were now in cahoots. There was a two-part system. There were provincial interrogation centers, where they got names and where Vietnam key leaders were, and then counter-terror teams would go in and take them out. I'm going to read an exact excerpt of what went on in the interrogation centers so that I'm not changing it at all or putting it in my own words or lightening it. As for the American role, you can't have an American there all the time watching these things. These things included rape, gang rape, rape using eels, snakes, or hard objects, and rape followed by murder, electrical shock, the Bell telephone hour, rendered by attaching wires to the genitals or other sensitive parts of the body like the tongue, the water treatment, the airplane in which a prisoner's arms were tied behind the back and the rope looped over a hook on the ceiling, suspending the prisoner in midair, after which he or she was beaten, beatings with rubber hoses and whips, and the use of police dogs to maul prisoners. All this and much more occurred in the provincial interrogation centers. Another key issue within the Phoenix program is that the CIA and a lot of these intelligence groups would be operating and doing unilateral operations alongside the military. So the CIA never really wants to give up information over to the military forces. However, they were relying on them a lot of the time to bring people in. So over time, the army stopped sending these prisoners, and they had a growing distrust of the CIA, obviously, because of that. So Lyndon B. Johnson engages in a massive bombing campaign throughout Laos and Cambodia that would be known as Operation Menu, and it's often overlooked, but it turned both countries into a wasteland, and they're still dealing with this today. The CIA sent people down to Vietnam to revitalize the field police there, but it didn't work because it wasn't really for the Vietnamese. It was clear that their intentions were elsewhere. So as a result, the United States made provincial reconnaissance units, the PRUs, which are going to be a mainstay throughout this whole story. They were the people who were bringing in people to interrogate. They led most of the charge, and it was often Vietnamese acting on other Vietnamese. It's important to note that they were directly led by the CIA. By the end of 1967, the field police had 12,000 people in it, and 59 different companies. There were so many different organizations and wings, and the Phoenix program would basically combine all of them. At this point, they had counterterrorism units, revolutionary development cadres, census bureaus, taking accounts of the full population and making profiles on everyone, the provincial interrogation centers, and other things that were already put in place in order to oppress the opposition. So the birth of Phoenix happened with Operation Kong Tak IV. This was the operational model for Phoenix and involved a ton of intelligence gathering against the MR4 and the Viet Cong within it. It started compiling these famous blacklists that would later dictate all of our actions there. Now, there was a disagreement between two key generals, General Lone from Vietnam versus Hart from the United States, that shows exactly how different the Vietnamese and the United States viewed what they were doing here. There's a big breakdown in language, customs, and ideals that the United States wasn't aware of, and they often didn't have the correct translations for certain terms. General Lone and Hart disagreed on capture methods in their counterterrorism 4 groups. So Lone had Colonel Dang Van Minh create what was called the Phung Hoang program to prevent Viet Cong infiltration into the Vietnamese government of the South, and he was focusing on monitoring people versus killing them, like the United States was doing. Phung Hoang was the Vietnamese bird of conjugal love that shows up in times of peace. This quickly turned into Phoenix, or what we know as the Phoenix program, the mythical bird that perpetually rises from its own ashes. Americans would even draw it with a blacklist in its claws. The United States began to set up district intelligence centers and command centers. If a person arrested at a district center was ID'd positively, they'd be sent to a PIC, the provincial interrogation centers, for interrogation. Daily reports were sent to the district command centers, notifying movements quicker, or at least that's what they were hoping for. This program and operation they are engaged in, Kong Tak 4, was turned into ISACs, standing for Intelligence Coordination and Exploitation, which is exactly what they were doing. The special branch that was supposed to be surveilling the enemy at the time was becoming totally pointless. This, from my understanding, seems like the Secret Service or people who were just spent their time keeping the existing Southern regime in power conveniently, and ensuring that they would combat anti communists when necessary, but mainly sticking behind a powerful figurehead and oftentimes being incentivized thereof. The United States was killing a ton of people at this point. The PRU was sent sometimes because they could actually peacefully do the job. That would eventually change dramatically. There's a lot of names and people involved with the program that I could say. However, I'm trying to just focus on some of the key events and actions that took place that outline why we were there and demonstrate the real incentives behind such a program and any of our efforts in Vietnam. I'm obviously skipping over quite a bit. These were some of the things I found the most pertinent. The United States was trying to also set up infrastructure everywhere, just like the Viet Cong already had. Nguyen Van Thu becomes president and takes power with the support of the CIA, already showing that it was jeopardizing the sovereignty of a foreign nation and influencing it quite politically by 1967. Then the CIA starts to expel any of the Kong Tak 4 operatives. There is a big difference between Kong Tak 4 and Operation Phoenix. In CT4, they weren't targeting civilians, and Vietnamese General Lone was involved versus purely the CIA. He didn't want to just kill everybody. So the Americans start putting up most wanted posters everywhere as part of their action plan, and they started having so many detainees it became a problem. And what are you supposed to do if they're not even prisoners of war? Remember here, there was no war, no declaration of war, and they're arresting civilians. What next? The overcrowded conditions cannot really be understated here. They were horrible. And in the fall of 1967, there was 42 province jails. They're mostly Viet Cong, or at least they claim, with 14,000 total capacity. There's about 35,000 more prisoners of war in military and labor camps from the Vietnamese military. There was no steps taken to establish due process for any of these civilian detainees at all. They were held up to 2 years without trial, like I said. They had illegal interrogations across the board, and most reports said that they were utilizing medieval apparatus when interrogating them, medieval torture devices. The United States set up standardized reporting on November 25th of 1967. It would include 3 key things, one being the number of Viet Cong agents eliminated, something very easily skewed and influenced by personal biases, the names of those eliminated, also something that could be skewed. And number 3, any significant acquisition, utilization, and other remarks as they went throughout the countryside trying to exploit the country. So at this point in the narrative, a lot of the revolutionary development cadres moved from their intelligence and displacement efforts in the rural countryside trying to divide the population towards more nation-building efforts that were aligned with what the United States wanted, of course. They would report on the Viet Cong infrastructure. However, there were so many internal conflicts within their ranks that they would only sometimes hand over information to Phoenix. Because obviously they knew that it was under the CIA's control and influenced by a very different group of people. You now had the provincial reconnaissance units and the field police operating under what would eventually be Phoenix. The United States was basically diverting Vietnam's own police force that was largely effective at first and didn't have too many issues with it given the circumstances, and they start switching the resources over and sending them elsewhere. The provincial reconnaissance units and the United States Marines were working extremely close together, exchanging assets that the United States had and bankrolling it in exchange for knowledge of local operations, what the CIA was doing, what the Vietnam government was doing, and obviously what the Viet Cong were doing as well. The provincial CIA officers sometimes knew more than the PRU advisors in an area, and they would be running it more hands-on. So you had Americans in charge that knew much more than the Vietnamese, who might have even had a higher title than them. a lot of the people fighting in the CIA, in the PRU, in these sort of death squads, were bailed out by the CIA from other countries for crimes like murder, rape, assault, etc. The Viet Cong had a ton of different guerrilla leaders. So, doing a big targeted effort to try and get one key figure in the Viet Cong infrastructure was extremely futile. There was just hundreds and thousands of reports being sent in trying to attack these people, but it was so decentralized and there's so many leaders in each individual village and locality that it was impossible to actually cut the head off the snake. Before 1968, there was some talk of the CIA negotiating with the North and South Vietnamese communists. Senator Eugene McCarthy, campaigning in 1967, put an end to this. And in January 31st, 1968, thousands attacked South Vietnam's towns and cities in what would be later known as the Tet Offensive. This was a mass mobilization proving that the Viet Cong were not only a political power and war was being waged against us, but they had their roots in every part of the civilization, whether that be in the North, the South, businesses, mom and pop shops, and whatever. In the daytime, a lot of Vietnamese in the South would support America, and in the nighttime, when the Viet Cong would roll around, they would then feed information right back to them. This was a matter of survival and being threatened from both angles. There were two hostile groups vying for control of the civilian population, so a lot of people just did their best to appease both. In the city of Hue, northern Vietnamese had their own blacklists and kill lists, and they buried hundreds of people alive in a mass grave. But this is also a bit of a hazy situation because the United States engaged in a big bombing campaign there previously. So, despite the gruesome numbers, there's a very good chance that some of the bodies were due to our actions as well. President Nixon conveniently convinced President Thieu at the time to postpone any sort of negotiations with the communists until the election. Thieu ends up appointing Prime Minister Huang, who hated Thieu's VP at the time, but Thieu hated the VP as well. So, the VP gets shot by accidental United States rocket fire. Yeah, convenient. The vice president's main aides and many were tied to General Lone, who was also murdered. And if you remember back, he was in constant conflict with one of the U.S. generals. Thieu then began to build his own puppet government in Vietnam. Phoenix had many issues from the very beginning. The Vietnamese didn't understand the term infrastructure. There was constant military versus special branch tension. They had scoreboards up on the screen, and they had reports and numbers and quotas to be met. So there were groups just vying to impress the White House the most and neutralizing as many people as possible. By the end of June 1968, over 6,000 Viet Cong were neutralized, and quotas formed in the summer of 1968 after that. This gave hungry policemen and people who might not have been paid as well before an opportunity to kill people and say that they're Viet Cong or take out their enemies. This was an organized murder operation. Some coordinators said it was extremely comparable to that of Nazi Germany and inflating the statistics of executions for Himmler. They would skew the data to make it seem like they were killing more of them, and they would even take innocent civilians, women and children, and just call them VCI. Some soldiers broke from the terror, but it emboldened a lot of others to keep fighting and to fight even harder. Conflicts with local field police and the provincial reconnaissance unit advisors started to pick up more and more, and it was largely due to the fact that these advisors and regional sort of managers were looking for their own personal bodyguards and battalions, and they embraced the black market. So having this sort of personal caravan enabled them to operate like gods. The CIA was launching penetrations into both the Viet Cong and the South Vietnam government at this point in time. And they sent in a special ops group over to Cambodia to find what was called the Moi 2 Battalion. And many people in the group died because it was so heavily infiltrated by communists. They had an example of everyone being lined up, instructing a spot, and then everyone got shot in the back of the head by a double agent. These unilateral operations by the military, the PRUs, and the CIA led to a lot of bureaucratic confusion constantly. One group would think they were swooping in to get a key Viet Cong member, and they might get captured before they could even get them. Or they could find out that it's actually a double agent that the CIA was utilizing the whole time. And if they arrested a Viet Cong leader, they might just immediately release them. What we were doing here is managing President Thieu's coup against the majority. We weren't sniffing out enemy combatants. We were installing fear amongst the populace. There was so many Vietnamese that were saying the right stuff to both the Southern Vietnamese government, aka us, and the Viet Cong. It was all about the survival. If they said where the Viet Cong was, B-52 strikes and napalm would rain on their entire village. So what kind of incentive did they have to actually report? Entire villages were taken out from spotters in the distance just seeing what they thought was a muzzle flash. Could have been anything. We wanted them to help us while we covered rural areas in Agent Orange. Soldiers in black pajamas took their bleeding ears, and province chiefs kept relief money that was supposed to go to their bridges, infrastructure, food, water. There were so many false accusations, farms were destroyed, and revolutionary development cadres were teaching the American view, which only led to more mistrust. The CIA was also constantly collaborating with the Viet Cong and Cambodians for information. So they were working with the people that they were claiming to be fighting. It showed that the United States wanted to seem successful no matter the cost, and the goal was the destabilization of the Vietnam culture and population as a whole. Any minor official could now extort families for bribes, even further destabilizing the general population. Many people in the South Vietnamese government military were arresting common criminals and basically extorting the Viet Cong in order to not arrest them. So calling normal people Viet Cong and getting nice little payments on the side from the real criminals that the United States was after. While this is going on, the provincial reconnaissance units and the CIA advisors that are in Vietnam stationed there were building safe houses and pretty big projects, ramping it all up. South Vietnamese military wanted money and black market items, not necessarily to deceive the United States in general. Their interests were more in survival, less than eliminating an entire political ideology, which was what we were trying to do. So Operation Phoenix has a very multifaceted approach at this point. We've got the CIA, we have the field police, the South Vietnamese military, the Southern Vietnamese government, the oppositional political party in the area, and the U.S. Army, all interacting. There was so much uncoordination in some of these programs that some Americans would even be teaching guerrilla tactics to people who didn't speak English. We were committing clandestine atrocities in places we didn't even live in, messing up entire families, households, and generations of people to come. Phoenix prevented a neutral Vietnam from ever occurring. By 1968, Nixon and Kissinger were on the scene. Oh, great. As some of you might know, Kissinger was quite friendly in terms of the bombing campaigns. And in February of 1969, Cambodian President Sihanouk worked with the United States to identify North Vietnamese people that were hiding there. They bombed very densely populated areas. The United States military withdrawals and efforts began as people learned more. about what we were actually doing there. They switched from military moves to more political ones as a result of this. It's much easier to hide from the general public. The new CIA staff were still in control, but they were moving over to the National Police Force, guising themselves behind South Vietnam. They were very proud of what they were doing. Let me please make a note of that. The Phoenix career program at the time was stellar, and it was to both learn how to become an advisor and progress in your career much faster than others. The Phoenix program was more of a concept, not an organization. They got a reputation of an assassination program, so the CIA searched for plausible deniability. They had plenty more issues than that. If a group reported good information to Phoenix, for example, they wouldn't even get the reward money. The country was already embracing the black market and corruption fully before we went in there. Towards the end, the Phoenix advisors became the sole source of monetary aid and any sort of infrastructure, nation building, or police force that the people of Vietnam could depend on. We were inflating numbers dramatically of what kind of Viet Cong we were catching, and we were not acting on intelligence. Numbers became much more important than communism. There's a general image here of South Vietnam being fought by this northern minority group hiding in the jungle, taking guerrilla tactics, and, fighting in these rural regions, knowing the land better than anybody else. However, in reality, it was essentially a small oligarchy in the South, led by Thieu, against a highly organized majority in the rest of the country that had been established for decades beforehand. The CIA learned quickly that covert ops are better than overt ones for public relations. By June 1969, Phoenix went from CIA run to MAC-V J2 run, a totally new military wing in operation. The CIA would now advise at a very high level, supposedly. After the formal withdrawal, the insurgent government made the Provisional Revolutionary Government, recognized by many countries immediately. Some of the psyops that they engaged in included broadcasting names in pamphlets versus word of mouth. They would use huge military resources and crack down more than ever. From 1968 to 1969, the number of Viet Cong infrastructure captured is less, but the number that they killed has been more than doubled. That's a big change. They're not asking as many questions, shooting a lot quicker. They had huge lists of names. Big Mac reports, they called them, for the Green Book. The number of VCI at large, unidentified, etc., trying to keep tabs on the entire populace. Some reforms ended up taking place in 1969. There was a new, totally bullcrap trial process put in place, and it became much more public what was going on with the Phoenix program. District leaders in South Vietnam wanted some explanations. The CIA was mounting new operations and not telling anybody. Phoenix was outlawing an entire ideology here. William Colby wanted it to be legitimized so it could be in the Vietnam Constitution. They wanted this to be a fundamental part of the way the country was run. To continue their efforts in Vietnam, the CIA launches the National Social Democratic Front. They're trying to support Thieu at the time and his government and suppress any of his opponents locally. The opponents were nationalists, people who believed in Vietnam, like the Dai Viets. While Thieu was worried about these opponents, he had about 30,000 communists within his ranks. Phoenix was totally infiltrated by that point. There was over 41 spies arrested, and some were very close to the president. There was just pure mismanagement by design. They accommodated a lot. There was corruption everywhere, and having double agents was commonplace. They were coming under increasing public scrutiny at the time, so Henry Kissinger steps up, tries to protect what he can. He's sending positive reports back to Capitol Hill the entire time, plotting an invasion at the exact same time, saying that we're trying to protect the retreating army. Pretty insidious. William Colby ends up becoming the #1 defender in the Phoenix hearings, as they try to figure out what really transpired and just how gruesome it was. He set a moral, legal, and popular ground for Phoenix to exist, and had all of the talking points prepared. The assassination program was debated and comes barely out in front of Congress. Phoenix had dire consequences, major repression of groups everywhere. It took precedent over civil law in the country of Vietnam for that time. America was hoping to promote democracy and Christianity against the, quote, demonic communists. We would have essentially eliminated any of our opponents and then been able to control Vietnam through our clients or people like Thieu. Phoenix, in a conceptual sense, is all the programs that it coordinated. It had a lot of different groups involved. And there were public informational aspects about it that really concealed its true purpose to the general public. Major dissensions started to occur, though. Nixon then invades Cambodia to fight the communist threat there, while Prince Sihanouk was away, conveniently. This was the culmination of over 12 years of covert action, and multiple groups trained by the CIA. They started slaughtering the Vietnamese there as well. They claimed to find a headquarter facility there for the Viet Cong, but it was evacuated. Union Oil of California, worth noting, got concessions for Cambodian oil at the time, and pro-American government was installed. The attention was driven away completely from the bloodbath that they were causing. The CIA was being quite dubious. They were very decentralized, and they're trying to recruit the Viet Cong. They forged documents to entrap them and launched attacks while also recruiting people in the South Vietnamese military or the South Vietnamese government to report on things. They were forging secret deals with the Viet Cong. Forged documents is a CIA specialty that might come up more. The Viet Cong had similar protocols. They would issue decrees mentioning the United States actions as well. So we were fighting an equal fight. So the United States was entrapping communists in a foreign country and trying to put them in jail or put them away for whatever they were doing. I mean, they often killed them. Let's fast forward a little. The United States government in 1970 then killed 4 after some Vietnam and Cambodia protests. Nixon then created the Plumbers, as we all saw in one of the Netflix shows, to fight anyone who opposed them. The USA spied on dissenters, and Operation Shamrock was launched, checking out on all the past veteran dissenters. They created a military intelligence group that reportedly watched Martin Luther King's murder. Many think that this domestic terror program, similar to Phoenix, still exists right on our doorstep today. All this in the name of national security is total BS. There was incestuous media relationships with the CIA and favors occurring left and right. The CIA had a very strong presence in the My Lai area during the massacre. Hundreds of North Viet Cong were there. Most interrogations resulted in death. There was over 1 million civilians killed and thrown out of helicopters, etc. I don't like listing off all the ways. There was many atrocities done by the Vietnamese at the end of the day, but we funded, built, trained, enabled, and set quotas to meet for them, and enforced that. This is seen in other countries too. We've done this before, and it has become a protocol. Phuong Hoang program was a constant threat to the lives of anyone in Vietnam. One of the biggest weaknesses of the South Vietnamese government was that they didn't really run on an ideology. Just not liking communism or trying to fight back against a very established majority wasn't very effective. The provincial reconnaissance units eventually were considered worse than Gestapo at times. Bill Taylor, a member of the Marines, investigated some of the crimes done by Americans at the time. He uncovered CIA hitmen and scenarios where CIA would hire them for private business disputes, like Pepsi even moving in on Coke in one scenario and trying to take out one of the regional leaders there. He even witnessed assassins go in and take out an entire cafe after trailing someone. He brought assassins in for justice. Bosses were furious, and the reports of Viet Cong attack were circulating, even though the CIA had done it. Within 5 days, he was relieved and transferred home. The friend that he had already sent documents to proving all of his allegations was broken into, and the documents were never recovered. There's been similar killings of American journalists, Linda Frazier, for example, and Orlando Letelier. There's obviously going to be quite a bit of aftermath and discussions following all this that occurred. The United States started investigating to see if we were violating the Geneva Conventions. I feel like we probably violated all of the conventions. William Colby argues only soldiers are protected by the convention. So only soldiers are protected by unnecessary warfare and acts of violence. It's fine for civilians to go through it, apparently. People from the military went on trial at hearings and said that any civilian detainees were automatically listed as Viet Cong, no matter their relationship to the program, showing that it was a sham and the numbers were just being inflated the entire time, while greedy businessmen and military personnel or district managers used forces for their own good, gain, and black market purposes. Secret police were the most hated and feared group in the nation, not the Viet Cong. They found that we violated the 1949 Geneva Convention, denying due process to thousands of Vietnamese. The United States kept stalling through 1971 to pass off blame to the South Vietnamese government versus withdrawing their committees. More and more, the CIA continued to control. Thieu eventually launched an offensive that arrests 50,000 people throughout Vietnam and another 14,000 per month after that. 125 Phoenix advisors were still in Vietnam in October of 1972. By 1975, there was over 45,000 official prisoners and 100,000 more in detention camps. Many sources say it was way, way higher. The cost of putting your enemy on the Phoenix hit list was $6 at one point. Think about that. Any enemy, whoever comes to mind, that first person who ticks you off at work, family member, whoever, $6. You could say that they are a political dissident and the government would just swoop in and take care of them. They would not have right to a trial and they might be in jail for up to 2 to 3 years or longer. There were a few decrees, circular orders, that basically moved arrests for national security to public order. The intelligence agencies were concerned with staying behind most of the operations now and operating in the dark. Hundreds stayed after the ceasefire was formally signed. Thieu broke the ceasefire and the Viet Cong counterattacked. The United States continued to withdraw aid after that. The provincial reconnaissance units during this entire time continued to torture in the interrogation centers and rape, not needing its creators anymore. They just went off and had their way with any of the prisoners there. By January 6th, 1975, the North Vietnamese was attacking, and many were still operating Phoenix under a new name and using shell company computer services. Northern Vietnamese kept advancing, and the Americans abandoned everything. The CIA abandoned 30,000 counter-terror agents in Vietnam. By April, fighting was everywhere, and Saigon fell. There's some things to consider here, everybody. It's a very old-school way of doing things, and it's purely been economic, time and time again, for the United States. Just like when we were in Iran. there's a bubble effect. The boys just end up moving elsewhere once the public ends up realizing what we're doing in one location. So whenever there's a big news headline, I encourage you to look at some of the countries that the news aren't focusing on and dig a little bit deeper into why some of these situations may be occurring. They eventually moved towards El Salvador. There's been a new practice of installing the Phoenix program via proxies. They have Israeli and Thai forces teaching counter-terror, psyops, and anything of the sort. We often train other groups to do our dirty work for us now. We started to teach rich landowners how to make death squads to serve them and basically organize criminals together. By December of 1980, 6 high-ranking El Salvadorian officials were kidnapped, tortured, and killed. The CIA operated through Department 5 of Civil Affairs. It was made in the mid-1970s. They had no uniformed death squads, dressed up like leftists and the Viet Cong. Hunter-killer teams and census coordination was constantly utilized. Operation Phoenix in January of 1986 was launched by El Salvador. I can't make this up. Same name. The Contra rebels in Nicaragua. They were doing quite a bit of terrorism. One group was even called the Phoenix Battalion, and they were known for being particularly gruesome. The Phoenix program is seen all around the world, whether that be at paramilitary checkpoints, criminal groups, selective terror, anti-terror operations, doing things in the name of national security, suspending due process in times of warfare, blaming it all on the leftists, and even framing them in certain scenarios. And anytime there's a blacklist with names on it, or death squad missions with ununiformed personnel, Phoenix and its influence is right there. After Alan Dulles, someone I've spoken of before, James Angleton kept working in the counterintelligence department of the CIA for quite some time. However, as his death approached, there were some things he said on his deathbed that I think are worth noting, especially after this episode. And I don't say this lightly. I'm taking this from The Devil's Chessboard by David Talbot. These were some of James Jesus Angleton's dying words. He delivered them between fits of calamitous coughing, lung-scraping seizures that still failed to break him of his cigarette habit, and soothing sips of tea. What he said was this: fundamentally, the founding fathers of U.S. intelligence were liars. Angleton told Trento in an emotionless voice. The better you lied and the more you betrayed, the more likely you would be promoted. Outside of their duplicity, the only thing they had in common was a desire for absolute power. I did things that, in looking back on my life, I regret, but I was a part of it and loved being in it. He invoked the names of the high eminences who had run the CIA in his day: Dulles, Helms, and Frank Wisner. These men were the grandmasters, he said. If you were in a room with them, you were in a room full of people that you had to believe would deservedly end up in hell. Angleton took another slow sip from his steaming cup. I guess I will see them there soon. I recently came across the concept of Inyun in Korean, and I loved it. It refers to the strings of providence that tie people together throughout each reincarnated life. If it's a simple brush of clothing passing on the street, there was likely something or an interaction between them in a past life. It sort of refers to all the invisible threads and fibers that make up the reality that we live in, and what sort of existence we could have had with a random passerby, or what sort of experiences we could have had through a twist of fate on a street corner, or just through a simple discussion on a sort of sunny afternoon with someone new. There's a sort of karmic fate to certain interactions, and whether people are fleeting or they stay for a long time. And I can appreciate that in Yun is all encompassing, because you could have met several times in a past life, some being good and some being bad. And everyone you pass by on a day-to-day has such a unique and deep experience that there's a chance you somewhere else got the chance to know. So we can pass by these people and these unfamiliar faces and think, what if? And what would have happened? And we can see those invisible threads sometimes. Maybe a stroke of luck or a certain feeling, and they'll get revealed to us briefly. But there's ties that bind us. And I'm definitely interested in exploring them. And another. Kitsune no yomeiri. When rain falls while the sun is shining, the foxes have weddings in broad daylight. The foxes are shape-shifting tricksters who deceive. I lived in a place where the rain fell when the sun is shining, and I'm glad I didn't stay to watch the wedding. Well, if you listened to today's episode, you genuinely enjoyed it, or I taught you something, I would really appreciate it if you could give the show a good rating, send it to a friend, and make sure to subscribe. I love doing this. It teaches me a lot of new things, it keeps me motivated, and it just feels good in general. These are topics that I really care about, and I would love nothing more than to continue studying these things and offering them to the general public so that more people can understand the world and see things the way I see them. Because it's a beautiful place out there, and people live multifaceted lives that are extremely fulfilling and different than our own. And if continuing to explore any of these things and what the human condition entails, and random rants from me, please continue to follow. I can't thank you enough. My name is Tyler Gallant. This is Imperialism in the Fringe. Have a good night.